Russia's assault on Ukraine is now in its fourth week. Russian forces continue to bombard the country while President Zelensky lobbies nations for aid. U.S. President Joe Biden traveled to Brussels this week to meet with leaders of NATO, the G7, and the EU. What is the situation on the ground in Ukraine? Here with an update, I'm joined by journalist, global affairs analyst, CNN contributor, Michael Bociurkiw. Michael, thank you. You're joining us from Lviv. You've been in Ukraine for about a month now. Tell me what the situation is like there in Lviv.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. The most graphic kind of picture I could give you right now is, as we're speaking, I've been looking outside my window and I'm next to a very old and beautiful cathedral. And as we speak, you have construction workers actually boarding up the windows, the beautiful stained glass windows. The reason they're doing that is it's still very much feared that the Russians could attack Lviv, this very old and beautiful city. And this is being played out actually all over Lviv. So as much as a lot of people like to think, well, we're already 1 month into this war and that maybe it will end soon, you know, no one knows the Russian psyche better than the Ukrainians. After all, they've been in this hybrid war with Russia for 8 years now, and they're preparing for the worst, even with those reassurances that we heard out of Brussels today.
President Zelensky said this week that the city of Mariupol has been reduced to ashes. I mean, we've seen the purposeful destruction of civilian targets by Putin in that city. If Putin intends to take over these major cities in Ukraine, why level them, Michael? What is the thinking here?
Yeah, well, it's part of the Russian playbook to bomb cities into submission or to level them. And to our minds, it doesn't make much sense. And you know, we can draw comparisons with Aleppo, for instance. But the Mariupol is actually a key port city, and it's on the kind of corridor which the Russians want to establish between mainland Russia and Crimea, which they illegally annexed in 2014. So, you know, whether there are people or not is, but you know, the other thing, and this isn't often brought up, is that at the same time he's throwing physical weapons, into these populated centers, he's also weaponizing migration. So we're now talking about as many as 10 million displaced inside Ukraine and outside Ukraine's borders. And this is a enormous burden on countries like Moldova, on countries like Poland and others. So I think it's a deliberate strategy to cause this kind of forced displacement. And one more quick thing, they're also forcibly displacing people into Russia. Many credible reports of people being forced to board buses into Russia proper, and then we don't hear from them again.
Yeah, no, that we don't often think about that and how, you know, he's hollowing out the population in Ukraine, so it becomes much easier to take it over. But as you say, weaponizes refugees by placing such burden on the surrounding countries. Do you fear that the type of attacks we're seeing in Mariupol, in other places as well, targeting apartment complexes, children's hospitals, that could be repeated throughout Ukraine in these other cities, including the one you're in tonight?
Yeah, well, that's, of course, the big fear. And, you know, right now where I sit, there's about 200,000 internally displaced people here seeking shelter. These are people who have chosen not to go beyond Ukraine's borders. I think what we're going to see is more of a concentration on the east, central, and southern cities of Ukraine. That seems to be their focus at the moment, especially, as we mentioned, Mariupol, but also Kherson and Kharkiv, which is the second biggest city and it's closest to the Russian border, is also being pummeled. So it does raise the question of, you know, the final intent of this terrible bombing. You know, what use are these hollowed out cities going to be to him? It's a horrible, horrible way. And of course, all of the war crimes being committed in the process as well.
Right. Now, Michael, I want your take on something I'm hearing predominantly in the American media, television networks. I've even seen it in some periodicals, that Ukraine is winning this war, that, they've killed 47,000 Russian soldiers and that they are winning this battle. It's only a matter of time. Your thoughts on that as somebody who studied this region, been there, and now been embedded there for a month. I mean, just give me your read on that type of reportage.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I hosted a Twitter Spaces yesterday, and we had, as part of it, Ilya Ponomarenko, who is one of the most respected war correspondents here. He's with the Kiev Independent. I recommend that people look him up. But that question was put to him whether, Ukraine is winning the war, and I think the sentiment was that it's definitely doing a lot better than expected. They're holding on to territory. They're repelling Russians away from pockets like Kiev where they're encircling the Russians. So, but a lot of this, of course, is the training that's happened over the years from Western partners, but also the new kit coming in. For example, the U.S. is providing Switchblade armed drones or kamikaze drones. So this will give them a much bigger upper leg. But then, if Mr. Putin decides to retaliate with chemical weapons, biological weapons, or God forbid, nuclear weapons, all of that isn't going to be of much help. And again, they could resort to more use of those long range, including hypersonic missiles that are virtually impossible to destroy in the air. So this still has a long way to play out, unfortunately. And I fear, and many others fear, more death and destruction.
Yeah, and he can fire missiles from Russia. He doesn't even have to come into Ukraine to do that. And
yes,
it's apparent he's willing to reduce these cities to rubble.
Yeah, many of the missiles have come from Russia, but also from the Black and Azov Seas and from high-flying aircraft. Some of their aircraft fly at about 50,000 feet, so you're not going to hit that from a backpack, surface-to-air missile. And that's why, logically, the Ukrainians are calling for a no-fly zone, or at least more of those MiG jets from places like Poland.
Yeah. President Joe Biden, as we reported earlier, landed in Brussels on Wednesday for this urgent meeting with members of NATO, the G7, European Union. Prior to leaving, he was asked by reporters if he was concerned that Russia would use chemical weapons. He answered this way.
I think it's a real threat.
Do you think Russia will use chemical weapons, Michael, in Ukraine? I mean, I have to tell you, just as somebody who's been covering global affairs like you for a long time, I'm feeling a bit of Saddam Hussein flashbacks here, I have to say.
Yeah. Well, look, they've used them elsewhere. They've used other weapons against populated centers in places like Chechnya. One of the types of missiles they're using is actually a technology that it lands and gives up big bursts of air and can destroy internal organs. I mean, this is the type of stuff they're using. So I believe he has the ability. There actually are reports of phosphorus already being used in the east of Ukraine. And, I just read that NATO said it's going to be bolstering its defenses against chemical, biological, and nuclear attacks. But I didn't hear the word Ukraine come into that paragraph. What are they going to do for Ukraine to better defend itself against these weapons? I got to say, the Ukrainians feel in many aspects very much alone in this war.
The U.S. and Europe have placed heavy sanctions on Russia. They've sent military aid to Ukraine. But the sanctions don't seem to be deterring Russia. What do you hope comes out of these Biden meetings with NATO members? I know you've had some concern about Biden's leadership of the allies here.
Right. Yeah, President Zelensky of Ukraine was literally begging for those sanctions to be implemented even before hostilities began. But the West didn't do that. They waited until hostilities began. I think that was a mistake. And yes, these are very serious sanctions. And I think, as a Western community of, like-minded and democratic nations, we should be getting to the point or arrived at the point where if you're a Russian oligarch or part of Mr. Putin's circle, the only place you're going to be able to go vacation is Pyongyang in North Korea, or maybe those artificial islands the Chinese are making in the South China Sea. But they still have to get, where it rarely goes below like 80 degrees Fahrenheit. But, they still have to get countries like Turkey, the Gulf states on board to also, freeze out or block Russian oligarchs from coming there. But the Russians have installed quite the sophisticated blackout for news. They're spreading a lot of false propaganda. A lot of folks in Russia don't know what's going on. And they've also arrested reportedly way over 10,000 people so far. So I don't. A lot of people say, well, maybe the sanctions will drive Russians to the point where they're going to revolt, but there's not much of a tradition for that in Russia. And even if they do, those institutions, KGB and so on, are so entrenched that it's very, very difficult to do.
This week, Ukrainian President Zelensky renewed calls for peace talks with Russia. But so far, Putin has refused. Russia sought assurances from Ukraine that they'll renounce plans to join NATO, a demand Kiev seems to be willing to agree to. Putin has accused the U.S. of using Ukraine to threaten Moscow. He's also justified the invasion, saying Moscow was defending against the genocide of Russian-speaking people by Ukraine. Now, Ukraine naturally says Putin's claims of genocide are nonsense. Is Russia at all interested, Michael, in peace with Ukraine? And what is Putin's endgame here?
Great questions. So I think in terms of the peace talks, I think what we've seen play out over the past 8 years since the Russians invaded the Donbass and took Crimea is that they do kind of show and tell. They'll show up at these talks, they'll promise certain things, and then they won't deliver what they promise. We've seen so many ceasefire agreements that have only lasted perhaps a few hours, and then they go back to regular business of fighting and killing. So there's a lot of there would be a lot of pressure on Mr. Zelensky should he enter into direct peace talks with Mr. Putin. Right now, I believe they're talking about Israel as being a broker of that peace agreement, but I think what's going to happen, you asked about the endgame, is Mr. Putin's going to demand concessions that no Ukrainian president could ever agree to. What I mean by that is recognizing Crimea as Russian, the Donbass, guaranteeing that they're not going to pursue NATO membership, and also what happens to the territory that's been seized in the past month. So it's going to be very, very difficult for Mr. Zelensky to go into these peace talks. And he's also floated the idea of a referendum on certain aspects, but these are very difficult things to do when you have a war going on, an active war, and when you have almost 10% of the almost a quarter of the Ukrainian population displaced.
Wow. As you just mentioned, 3.5 million Ukrainians have left their country. And these are, again, estimates. It's probably much higher. And they're now refugees living in the nearby countries, over 2 million in Poland. Yep. However, there are 6.5 million internally displaced Ukrainians. Where are they going predominantly, Michael?
Well, actually, most of them are here in the West because it's regarded as a safe haven. Here in Lviv, but also in smaller towns and villages. And I know, for example, there are great NGOs like the Ukrainian Educational Platform, people can look them up, that are helping to establish inclusive communities for, kind of semi-permanent housing that folks can go and move in and lead as normal life as they can until things subside. Because don't forget, you have cities like Mariupol, you have cities like Kharkiv that have really been heavily destroyed. So it's going to take some time for them to go back to where they came from. Look, the other thing I have to say is that a lot of the folks I've talked to who have gone to Poland and neighboring countries, I don't get the sense they're that keen to going far away. Canada and the U.S. The U.S. has just announced 100 spaces for 100,000 refugees. Yeah, and I've talked to refugees, for example, applying to enter Canada. They too have a special program. You have impossibly long lineups at the Canadian embassies, the UK embassy. They're asking for things like biometrics. You're not going to get that on the border or in a small village in Poland. So I don't want to say that these are intentional bottlenecks to, make the flow smaller, but they have to make it easier on people. A lot of them came with just maybe a duffel bag if they're lucky. A lot of them fled without even their documents. So yeah, right. I'm shocked by the bureaucratic barriers that are still there, too.
Ukraine is full of churches, Michael, both Orthodox and Catholic.
Yes.
What kind of help are churches and religious organizations able to offer at this point?
Yeah, well, I'm basically in the city of churches. There's one, as I said, right below me, and I was there on Sunday. And while the air sirens were wailing across the city, the churches were packed. And I've never seen such intensity and sense concentration and devotion. Every word the priest was saying to bring some kind of comfort really resonated. I think churches here, they can provide refuge, but it's mostly temporary. We have Catholic and Orthodox here. So, but they're usually not that well resourced. They're going to also require quite a bit of financial support in order to help these refugees. But of course, they're very well placed to do it. And the other thing I should say, even pre-war, a lot of Ukrainians didn't have much trust in the government. So it's going to be up to faith leaders as well to not only comfort people, but to give them advice on what to do and where to go, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Pope Francis is consecrating Ukraine and Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary this week. How do you think the people in Lviv feel about that? And how is their faith sustaining them through this, Michael?
It's hard for me to answer the first question because I haven't spoken to anyone about that. But in terms of the faith, like that vignette I told you about just on Sunday, and also the previous Sundays as well, is that people will choose in many cases to go to a church rather to a bomb shelter for protection. So that gives you an idea of where, look, Ukrainians have traditionally been very, very strong believers. They turn to the church for many, many things, especially in times of famine, in terms of war. And then also, the Ukraine has a long history of the church being persecuted, priests killed, shot down by the Soviets and sent to the Gulag. So it's been a church that has been very much persecuted in the past, but it always tends to spring back and go underground if need be as well. So, there's a very active monasteries and seminaries here. A few miles away from me is the Ukrainian Catholic University, which does some fantastic work and also requires a lot of donations too. So there's a huge kind of Christian infrastructure here to help folks.
Michael Bociurkiw, thank you so much for being with us, for your insights. You can follow Michael's reporting on Twitter at World Affairs Pro. Michael, thanks again. Be safe.